This Andy Ruiz-Chris Areola fight shocked me. The first thing which shocked me was Chris Areola's weight, 228 pounds. Now, I know Chris Areola fought at light heavyweight in the amateurs, but I've been watching him for years in the pro game, and I've never seen him come in anywhere close to this light for any of his previous fights before. Now, if we look at his record here, go back to his first loss, which was to Vitaly Klitschko back in 2009. He was 251 pounds for that. 250 against Thomas Adamek, another fight he lost. Fast forward to the Eric Molina fight, 245. The first Berman Stavern fight, 247. 239 in a Stavern rematch. 246 against Deontay Wilder. 244 in his previous fight to Andy Ruiz against Adam Kownacki. So at 228, I was absolutely shocked at how light he was. Now, I have to ask the question, why did Areola wait until the age of 40 to get himself in this kind of condition? What made the difference? Was it because he was fighting a fellow Mexican for bragging rights within their community? What was it? Did that evoke more pride in Areola than normal? Or perhaps it was the fact that Areola always wanted to be the first ever Mexican heavyweight champion and Ruiz beat him to it. Maybe in Areola's mind, if he can't become the first ever Mexican heavyweight champion, then the next best thing is to beat the guy who did become the first Mexican heavyweight champion. Who knows? The next thing which shocked me in this fight was Chris Areola's footwork. He's got a back foot game all of a sudden. Where did that come from? I alluded to the possibility pre-fight that Areola might try and emulate Anthony Joshua in the Ruiz rematch, since he did have the height and reach advantage over Ruiz here. But I thought he was maybe too macho to want to try and box like that. Another thing which shocked me was Chris Areola's defense. He didn't get hit with anywhere near as many clean punches in this fight as we typically see from him. He normally fights with his face. Whereas in this fight, when he did get caught, he fought with his hands high for the most part, and he was on the back foot, as I say. And when he did get caught, he was typically turning away from the punch or leaning away from the punch, so it took the sting off it. This was the best I've ever seen Chris Areola's defense, again, at the age of 40. Another thing which shocked me was Chris Areola's accuracy and timing in this fight. Now, he'd been out the ring even longer than Ruiz, but he showed far fewer signs of ring rust. Ruiz often throws wide hooks. Not always, but very often. And to be fair, in this fight, Ruiz's hooks actually looked a lot tighter than normal. But Areola's hooks were even tighter still, and they were better timed than Ruiz's. The old adage in boxing is timing beats speed, and Areola's timing was very good in this fight, especially early on. The next thing which surprised me is Chris Areola managed to drop Andy Ruiz. Now, Areola's always had power, but he's never been a one-punch KO man. Ruiz has always showed a solid chin in the past as well. I thought this fight had a decent chance of going the distance based upon what I saw in the Kownacki fight, but I thought if anyone was going to hit the deck, it would be Areola, not Ruiz, especially given Areola's age and his previous lack of defense. So I was definitely very surprised. I was shocked to see Andy Ruiz on the canvas. Another thing which shocked me was the improvements that Andy Ruiz made. He showed much improved mobility, fluidity, foot speed, and actual footwork. I expected to see improvements under Eddie Reynoso based upon the training footage that I'd seen in the run-up to this fight, but the technical and athletic improvements which he showed actually exceeded my expectations. He was boxing on the back foot, up on his toes, popping out double jabs at times, which is something I never thought I'd ever see Andy Ruiz doing. So to move on to the fight itself, Ruiz was a bit over-eager early on. He was billed as the new Andy Ruiz in the pre-fight preliminaries. And as soon as the fight started, it looked like he wanted to show the world all his new moves. He was a little overconfident, which he admitted himself after the fight. Didn't show quite enough respect to Chris Areola. Now, Areola, boxing on the back foot, again taking a leaf out of Anthony Joshua's book, was actually trying to counterpunch the counterpuncher. Andy Ruiz, as we all know, he's a pressure fighter that likes to counterpunch on the front foot. Areola turned that situation on its head, and he was trying to let Ruiz, who was very eager to impress, lead off and then counter him. So, as I say, Areola's hooks were a bit tighter. And as I've already mentioned, timing beats speed. And it's possible that Andy Ruiz was a bit surprised by Areola's approach. Perhaps he didn't expect him to box this way and be looking to counterpunch. As I said before, Ruiz was leading off more than usual on the front foot early in the fight. And when you do that, it leaves you more vulnerable. And that's where the knockdown happened. Ruiz was looking to land the right hand, I think, and Areola beat him to the punch. Ruiz kind of walked into it and he touched down on his knee. He wasn't particularly hurt. It was more of a flash knockdown and he recovered almost instantly, but it was still a surprise. In the third round, Ruiz was nearly knocked down again. This time he was trading left hooks. And again, Areola got there first with the shorter, tighter shot. Now, eventually, Ruiz figured out that it wasn't a good idea to trade with Areola because Areola's timing was good and his hooks were tighter. At which point, Ruiz literally turned the tables. He got on the back foot, he started popping a jab, and he allowed Areola to come to him, whereby he then became the counterpuncher. So it was a complete role reversal. And this is where Ruiz started to take control of the fight with his extra hand speed and, dare I say it, extra foot speed as well, despite the fact that he was still significantly heavier than Chris Areola. Also, Areola picked up a shoulder injury. I think it was, his left shoulder, where Andy Ruiz landed a right hand just behind the back of Areola's shoulder, which seemed to injure it. And that obviously helped Andy Ruiz along the way. I'm not saying he wouldn't have won if that hadn't happened, but it certainly wasn't to Ruiz's detriment, Areola injuring his shoulder like that. So Ruiz popped and moved through combinations off the jab and boxed his way to victory. I can't believe I'm even saying this because I never imagined I'd ever see Andy Ruiz boxing like this. Now, the scorecards were way too wide. It's always very disappointing when you see cards like that in a competitive fight, but ultimately the right man won. Despite a good start from Areola, he didn't do quite enough and was basically outworked for the majority of the bout. Like most people, I expected Ruiz to win this fight without any trouble at all. I laughed at the pay-per-view billing. Areola looked terrible in the Wilder fight. He looked completely washed up. He looked like a man who had no motivation anymore and was just turning up for a paycheck. But against Ruiz, he surprised me, no doubt about it. And I know some people are going to mention the Kaunaki fight. I don't think I ever saw the Kaunaki fight from start to finish. I think I maybe saw highlights. In the Kaunaki fight, as we can see, Areola apparently broke the CompuBox record for most punches thrown by a heavyweight in their 34-year history. Now, Ike Ibeabuchi and David Tua back in 1997 broke some kind of record. I don't know if it was CompuBox or PunchStat or which organization exactly, but Ibeabuchi threw more punches in 12 rounds against David Tua than either Ali or Joe Frazier did over 14 rounds in the Thriller in Manila. So I'm not sure if Areola has broken Ibeabuchi's record. Again, there could be a difference between CompuBox, PunchStat. I don't know if this record is right the way across the board or it's just for a specific organization. Either way, it's impressive that Chris Areola, as old as he is, was able to throw that many punches. Even though he didn't win the fight, by all accounts, he lost convincingly. Still, being able to throw that amount of shots is impressive. But for me, more impressive was his technical performance against Andy Ruiz. Although, as I say, ultimately, he just got outworked by Ruiz in the end. So, what conclusions can we come to with regards to this Andy Ruiz-Chris Areola fight? Well, first of all, there are a lot of questions. And the first question has to be, has the weight loss diminished Andy Ruiz's punching power? I know a lot of people are saying it has, because Chris Areola has been stopped 3 times in the past, but Ruiz never even came close to dropping Areola, much less stopping him. Well, Areola has always shown a pretty solid chin. Of his 3 stoppage defeats, only one of them was a proper knockout. In his defeat to Vitaly Klitschko, he never actually went down in the fight. It was an accumulation of shots over the long haul. He took a steady beating, basically, until his corner pulled him out at the end of the 10th round, I think it was. In the Wilder fight, it was a similar situation. He did go down once, but it wasn't a particularly heavy knockdown. He just took a knee. Wilder is probably the hardest puncher in the division, but he didn't manage to lay Areola out. Again, it was more of an accumulation of shots over the course of several rounds, and his corner pulled him out. The only time Areola got properly laid out in a fight was in the Stavern rematch. So my point is, Areola's always been tough. He's been in there with big punchers like Klitschko and Wilder, and they had to land cleanly and consistently round after round to wear him down and eventually stop him. Ruiz simply wasn't able to land as cleanly or consistently on Areola as Klitschko and Wilder did. If he was landing as clean and consistently as those guys were, then perhaps he could have stopped Areola. Who knows? But he wasn't able to. And that's testament to Areola's improved defense, his tactics, and Ruiz's inability to set up his power shots effectively. So I wouldn't jump to the conclusion that his power was diminished. He didn't land cleanly or consistently enough to be able to say that. I mean, just look at Areola. He lost a similar amount of weight to Ruiz, came in at his career lightest, but his power didn't seem diminished, did it? So I don't think we can make any snap judgments here. Also, in the second half of the fight, Ruiz was up on his toes. So he wasn't really sitting down on his shots when he did land in the second half of the fight. You know, I remember when Dylan White fought Derek Chisora the first time, a lot of people were claiming White lacked power because he couldn't get Chisora out of there. But I was telling people that that was a hasty conclusion to come to because he never actually managed to catch Chisora as flush as he caught a lot of other guys. Whereas in the rematch, he did land flush and Chisora was out cold. Another example would be Sergio Martinez in the Paul Williams rematch. You know, sometimes you'll fight a guy and you're landing, but you're never quite able to land flush with proper leverage. It's always just slightly the wrong angle or slightly the wrong range, or you didn't land quite on the knuckles and so on. And that can give the illusion that you don't have the power to hurt the guy, when in reality, you're just not able to quite catch him right. Also, how big a puncher is Andy Ruiz anyway? I mean, he has power, he can punch, but he's never been a one-punch knockout merchant. Aside from the first knockdown in the first AJ fight, all the other knockdowns in that fight came from a barrage of punches. I remember when Andy Ruiz fought Sergey Liakovic. Ruiz was 267 pounds in that fight. In fact, let's find it here. Sergey Liakovic, I think it was 2014? There we go, 2014. He was 267 pounds. Okay, now, Liakovic had been knocked out on numerous occasions prior to fighting Andy Ruiz. Okay, so Ruiz weighed 267, which is pretty much the same weight as he weighed for the first AJ fight, but went the distance with Liakovic. Liakovic had previously been knocked out by Maurice Harris. He'd been knocked out by Shannon Briggs. He'd been knocked out by Robert Helenius. He was stopped by Bryant Jennings. He was knocked out in one round by Deontay Wilder. Hey, look here. All these knockout defeats prior to getting in there with Andy Ruiz. And yet Ruiz never even drops him from what I can remember, never comes close to stopping him. And again, this is when Ruiz was 267. And he wasn't able to get Liakovic out of there, Liakovic, however you want to pronounce it, when he'd been stopped numerous times recently before that Ruiz fight. So even when Ruiz has been heavier, there's been fights where he hasn't been able to get guys out of there who are not particularly durable. So he's never been a one-punch knockout guy. In most cases, he needs to land consistently. He needs to be able to put his shots together in order to get you out of there. So I don't see his inability to stop Areola as particularly alarming, to be honest. In fact, I said in my fight preview back in March that I wouldn't be surprised if this Ruiz-Areola fight ends up being like the Kownacki-Areola fight, and that fight went the distance, obviously. So the prospect of this fight going 12 rounds wasn't out of the question in my mind at all. I just expected Ruiz to be a lot more dominant than this, and I certainly didn't expect him to get dropped. And that brings us on to the next question. Andy Ruiz's punch resistance. Has the weight loss made his chin worse? Well, Ruiz has been around this weight many times in the past. He was a similar weight against Tor Hamer, for example, and he took a lot of clean power shots bang on the chin from Hamer in that fight, and he barely even flinched, much less went down. Now, I don't know how hard Tor Hamer actually hits compared to Chris Arreola, but his shots were just bouncing off Andy Ruiz in that fight like raindrops. Again, Ruiz was the same weight for that fight as he was against Areola, but his punch resistance seemed absolutely fine back then. You know, normally when a fighter has diminished punch resistance due to weight loss, they tend to look lethargic in general. They tend to lack energy. They lack bounce in their legs, like Riddick Bowe when he fought Andrew Golota in the rematch, for example, or Chris Bird when he dropped down to light heavyweight at the end of his career. Both guys looked leaden-footed and unsteady before they'd even been clipped. But with Andy Ruiz, it wasn't like that at all. He was bouncing around the ring and looked to have plenty of energy. He didn't look at all leaden-footed the way Riddick Bowe or Riddick Bowe or Chris Bird did in the situations I just mentioned. So I'm not sure if it was the weight affecting Andy Ruiz's punch resistance. You know, Lennox Lewis on the PBC broadcast said that it was a wake-up shot Andy Ruiz got hit with in that second round. And he mentioned the fact that when you've been out the ring for a long time, obviously Ruiz has been sparring in training camp and what have you, When you've been out the ring for a long time and you get hit flush for the first time in the ring for, what, a year and a half with little 10-ounce gloves on, it can be a bit of a shock. It can take you time to adjust to taking punches again. And so that could have been a factor for Andy Ruiz in terms of the way he reacted when he got clipped. But another thing I will say is being significantly lighter means you can get knocked off balance more easily. Not hurt necessarily, just knocked off balance. Because Ruiz was, 20 odd pounds lighter here than he was for the AJ rematch, or was it 30 pounds? And he was a lot lighter, 15 pounds or something, than the first AJ fight. So Ruiz needs to be mindful of that, and he may need time to adjust accordingly. Again, when you're a lot lighter than you're used to being, shots that hit you anywhere are more likely to knock you off balance. Okay? Just because your body doesn't have as much resistance in it because it's not as heavy. Again, this is not about being hurt necessarily, it's just about being knocked off balance. So again, he needs to adjust to that. And again, I go back to Areola. He lost a similar amount of weight to Ruiz, but it didn't seem to hurt his punch resistance, did it? And I say this to all the people who are quick to jump to the conclusion that Ruiz losing the weight has messed up his punch resistance. Did it mess up Areola's punch resistance? I know Ruiz didn't really manage to catch Areola as flush as he caught AJ or whatever, but still, there didn't seem to be any perceptible deterioration in Areola's punch resistance despite significant weight loss. You know, it's all about how you go about losing the weight. If you lose the weight in the right way, slow and steady, and you're not draining yourself, then you really shouldn't experience any issues as far as punch resistance, but everybody's different. And perhaps for some, losing weight has more of an impact on punch resistance than others. With that being said, even when Ruiz was heavy, he was dropped hard in the first AJ fight, and even in the rematch, he had his knees buckled. Anyone who was paying attention would have caught this. He had his knees buckled in the first round by a fairly innocuous looking right hand from AJ. That wasn't anything like the hardest AJ can throw his right hand. He just threw a shot out there just to, keep Ruiz in place. And Ruiz's knees buckled and his eye got cut from that shot. So Ruiz has a good chin, but he's never had a Marius Wack type chin. He's never had an Oliver McCall type chin. He's got a solid chin, but it's not an iron jaw, that's for sure. And as I said previously, Ruiz was leading off a lot more in the Areola fight than we're used to seeing. Normally, he remains in a defensive posture with a high guard, braced to anticipate the opponent's lead. He then lets them throw first, then he'll block the shot or slip it, and then counter. He'll fire back. He's normally the one surprising his opponent with fast counters, whereas against Areola, he was leading off a lot more, especially early, and Areola was the one surprising him with counters. And it's the shots that surprise you that tend to hurt you the most. Ruiz is not used to being surprised. It's normally him who's doing the surprising. So this is something you have to take into account when you're looking at what happened in this Ruiz-Areola fight. The next question people will inevitably be asking is, should Andy Ruiz go back to being heavier? Well, in my opinion, absolutely not. I actually think he should continue to lose weight. Oh yes, I'd like to see Andy Ruiz eventually down in the 230s. I think he just needs time to adjust to the new weight and the new style as well, because Eddie Reynoso has got him fighting quite differently to the way he's used to. So this is a transitionary phase. Canelo has talked about becoming a heavyweight version of Canelo. Well, Canelo doesn't get caught with the types of shots that Ruiz got caught with in this fight. Canelo has a higher ring IQ and a better defense than Ruiz. He knows when to punch and when not to punch. He knows how to avoid putting himself in vulnerable situations. Just think about Canelo against Danny Jacobs. Think about Canelo against Golovkin. You didn't see him getting caught with the kind of left hooks, for example, that Andy Ruiz got caught with in the third round against Areola. Canelo knows when it's the right time to throw his hook. Do you understand what I'm saying? So, Andy Ruiz, in my view, he shouldn't be worried about the fact that he got dropped so much. What he needs to be worried about is the fact that he got caught flush. He needs to go and watch the tape of the fight and figure out why that happened and correct the mistakes. As I say, Canelo very rarely gets caught flush, so he's the perfect guy for Ruiz to learn from. He just needs to not get discouraged, stay disciplined, and trust the process. Ruiz has lost a lot of weight, but he's also done a lot of work on strengthening his legs. And the combination of those two things allows him to move much better than he ever has before and pull off moves in training and in fights which was simply not possible when he was heavier. It gives him more options as far as tactics and strategy. He can switch it up on the fly if need be. So I think it would be a terrible mistake for him to put the weight back on. But boxing fans are reactionary, so I'm sure plenty of them are going to disagree. It's like when Amir Khan first hooked up with Virgil Hunter. He did not look good against Carlos Molina or Julio Diaz. But once he settled in and adjusted to Hunter's teaching style and teaching methods, eventually everything clicked. And he put on very good performances against Luis Collazo and Devon Alexander. And I think it's going to be the same for Andy Ruiz. He just needs time to adjust. Therefore, I actually think the immediate rematch with Areola is not a bad idea. I know I ridiculed the first fight being on pay-per-view, and Areola ended up surprising me, but I'm looking at this purely from a learning perspective for Andy Ruiz. If they run it back in, say, 3 months or so, then Ruiz would have the chance to correct his mistakes and measure his improvement. I'm assuming Deontay Wilder's going to have a tune-up as well before he fights a top 10 heavyweight again. So if they're planning to match him against Ruiz, then there should still be time for a Ruiz-Areola rematch around July or August maybe. But as I say, if Ruiz goes up in weight again, the kind of moves he was pulling in the second half of this fight, where he was up on his toes, where he was popping a jab, the kind of mobility he showed, that's all out the window if he piles on 15, 20 pounds again and comes in a similar weight to what he was in the Anthony Joshua fight, the first fight. That's all out the window. Okay? Why take that versatility away from him? The mobility. He had more mobility in his upper body, more nimble on his feet. And yes, that's not just to do with the weight loss, it's also strengthening the legs. But if he gains more weight back, that's more strain on the legs. You see what I'm saying? One of the main reasons that he won this fight against Chris Arreola is because he had a plan B, which was getting up on his toes and boxing and turning counterpuncher rather than counterpuncher on the front foot, counterpuncher on the back foot. So losing the weight and changing his style gives him more versatility. He just needs time to adjust to it all. That's all it is. It's a transitionary phase. As I mentioned with Amir Khan when he first teamed up with Virgil Hunter, a few teething problems, but once he got settled in with Hunter, you could see it was the best move for him. Obviously, he still lost to Canelo and all that kind of stuff, but, it is what it is. Ultimately, I feel like Virgil Hunter was the best trainer for Amir Khan. That's the best he ever looked technically. And for Andy Ruiz, I think he's going in the right direction. He just needs to trust the process. Don't get discouraged. Continue down this road. Continue losing weight. Yes, continue losing weight. Slow and steady. He's not trying to go in there and get as much weight off as possible, but continue watching his diet. Continue training hard. Continue, absorbing the professionalism that they have in that Canelo camp. And his weight is sure to come down by itself anyway. You could see his body shape was different. Even though he was the same weight in some previous fights as this, his body shape never looked like this before. You could almost see abs underneath the layer of fat covering Ruiz's belly. You could see abs underneath there. So he just needs to continue this process to become the best version of himself that he can possibly be. That's my view on it. But let me know what your view is in the comments below, and I'll catch you on the next one. I'm out.